Hello, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently onto the sun-warmed slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the most sacred place in the ancient Greek world awaited those who sought wisdom from the gods themselves. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through a sanctuary where kings and peasants alike travelled across seas and mountains, bringing questions that weighed heavy on their hearts. We walk the sacred way, that ancient path lined with treasuries built by grateful cities, where pilgrims climbed in reverent silence toward the temple, where Apollo spoke through his chosen priestess. We stand before the spot where the Pythia sat upon her sacred tripod, breathing vapours that rose from deep within the earth, her words tumbling forth in riddles that shaped the fate of empires and guided the course of wars that would echo through the centuries. Each episode here isn't just about dates and ruins. It's not about memorising names of gods or the architectural details of temples catalogued in textbooks. It's about the desperate hope in a merchant's eyes as he asked whether his ships would return safely, the trembling hands of a young woman seeking guidance about marriage, the proud bearing of a general wondering if the gods favoured his battle plans. It's about the mystery they believed in, the faith that sustained them, the questions that brought them to this rocky mountainside where heaven seemed to touch earth. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. Long before the Parthenon rose above Athens, before Alexander dreamed of conquering the known world, before Rome was even a collection of mud huts on 7 hills, there was Delphi. Perched on the steep southern slopes of Mount Parnassus, this rocky sanctuary overlooked a landscape of such breathtaking beauty that ancient travellers believed it could only be the dwelling place of gods. Below stretched the valley of the Pleistos River, silver-green with endless olive groves that shimmered in the Mediterranean sunlight. Above loomed the twin peaks called the Phaedriades, the shining ones, their limestone faces catching the morning light and throwing it back like polished bronze. The Greeks called this place the Omphalos, the navel of the world, and they marked it with a sacred stone carved with intricate networks of wool-like bands. According to their stories, Zeus himself had determined this spot's significance by releasing 2 eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and here, at Delphi, the birds had met in flight. This was the centre, the axis around which everything turned, the point where mortals could reach upward and gods could reach down, where the boundary between human and divine grew thin as morning mist. In the 8th century before the Common Era, as Greece emerged from its dark age of forgotten writing and lost palaces, Delphi was already ancient, already sacred, already whispered about in songs and stories passed from grandfather to grandson. The site had been holy for centuries, perhaps millennia, long before Apollo claimed it as his own. Some said it had first belonged to Gaia, the Earth Mother herself, guarded by her serpent child Python, a creature of such terrible size that its coils could encircle the mountainside. But Apollo, the god of light and prophecy, music and healing, had slain the Python with his silver bow, taking the sanctuary as his prize. The Greeks commemorated this victory every 8 years with elaborate ceremonies, young men acting out the battle, the death of the great serpent, Apollo's purification and triumphant return. The god's temple rose where Python's blood had soaked into the earth, and from that very spot, from a crack in the rock floor, vapours still rose, carrying with them the voice of the god himself. The people who lived in the villages scattered across these mountainsides, who tended the olive groves and goat herds, who pressed oil and made cheese and wove wool into cloth, these people knew the mountain's moods. They knew how clouds gathered suddenly around the peaks, how thunder rolled through the gorges, how springs of pure cold water burst from the rock face. They knew that certain places felt different, that standing in particular spots made the hair rise on their arms, made their breath come shallow, made them feel watched by something vast and ancient and not quite comprehensible. The temple priests, those who tended Apollo's shrine and interpreted his messages, understood that this power, this sense of divine presence, was what drew people here. Not just Greeks, though Greeks came in their thousands, but Lydians from wealthy Anatolia, Egyptians from the Nile Delta, Etruscans from Italy, even Scythians from the distant steppes beyond the Black Sea. They came with questions, with offerings, with desperate hopes that the god would speak to them, would give them certainty in an uncertain world. The early temple, before the great stone structures that would later rise, was a simple building of wood and thatch, but it held something no palace could claim. It held the presence of Apollo, manifested through his priestess, the Pythia. She was the god's voice, his medium, the woman through whom divine knowledge flowed into the mortal realm. Without her, Delphi would have been just another pretty place on a mountainside. With her, it became the spiritual centre of the Greek world, the place where the future could be glimpsed, where fate itself might be negotiated with the gods. And so they came, year after year, century after century, climbing the rocky path, bringing silver and gold, bringing questions that kept them awake at night, bringing hope that here, at the navel of the world, they might hear something true, something eternal, something that would help them navigate the chaos of mortal existence. The world was about to witness how one sacred place, one priestess breathing sacred vapours, one god speaking through stone and smoke, would shape the course of Western civilization in ways that still echo in our own time. For nearly 2,000 years after the last oracle fell silent, Delphi slept beneath layers of earth and forgetting. Byzantine Christians had closed the pagan sanctuaries, seeing them as doorways to demons rather than gods. Earthquakes had toppled columns, landslides had buried treasuries. The village of Castri, with its simple stone houses and narrow lanes, had grown directly over the ancient ruins, its inhabitants farming the terraces, grazing their sheep on hillsides that once hosted the most important religious festivals in the Greek world, completely unaware that beneath their floors lay temples and theatres and treasuries filled with offerings from across the ancient Mediterranean. Travellers in the 18th and 19th centuries, those early wanderers who came to Greece with classical texts in hand and romantic notions in their heads, knew that Delphi must be somewhere in these mountains. Ancient writers had described the sanctuary in loving detail. Pausanias, that tireless tourist of the 2nd century of the Common Era, had walked the sacred way and recorded every statue, every inscription, every treasury building. But matching those ancient descriptions to the modern landscape proved frustratingly difficult. The geography had changed. Rivers had altered course. Earthquakes had reshaped the mountainside. In 1860, a French archaeologist named Paul Foucard arrived in Castri and began asking questions. He studied the ancient texts, examined the landscape, talked with local farmers who sometimes turned up marble fragments in their fields. Slowly, painstakingly, he became convinced that Castri stood directly over ancient Delphi, that the village itself, with its 40 or 50 families, their homes and churches and gardens, covered the most important oracle sanctuary of the ancient world. But knowing where Delphi lay and actually excavating it were two entirely different challenges. The villagers of Castri were understandably reluctant to abandon their homes, even for the sake of archaeology. These were not wealthy people. Their houses, their fields, their olive trees represented generations of labour, family inheritance, survival itself. You could not simply ask them to move because Frenchmen wanted to dig up old stones. The French school at Athens, that prestigious institution dedicated to studying Greek antiquity, began negotiating. They offered to build a new village, New Castri, just west of the ancient site. They promised fair compensation. They invoked Greek national pride, arguing that uncovering Delphi would restore glory to the Greek people, would show the world the magnificence of their ancestors. The discussions dragged on for years, tangled in bureaucracy, funding difficulties, and the very human resistance to being uprooted from ancestral homes. Finally, in 1892, the French government allocated substantial funds. The village of Castri was purchased, house by house. The residents were compensated and relocated to New Castri, where new homes awaited them, and then, at last, the excavation could begin. The director of the project was Théophile Homole, and he approached the work with both scientific rigour and genuine reverence for what lay hidden. This was not merely archaeology. This was uncovering the place where ancient peoples had believed they could speak directly with divinity. The first seasons of digging revealed the sanctuary in layers. The Turkish and Byzantine occupations had left their marks, churches built from ancient columns, houses constructed with marble blocks inscribed with dedications to Apollo. Beneath these medieval remains, the Hellenistic and classical levels began to emerge. The excavators found themselves walking on ancient paving stones, touching walls that had stood for 2,500 years, uncovering inscriptions that named kings and cities long vanished from living memory. But the most breathtaking discovery came as they cleared the main temple terrace. There, exactly where Pausanias had described it, stood the foundations of Apollo's temple, the great structure where the Pythia had delivered her prophecies. The temple had been rebuilt multiple times after earthquakes and fires, but its footprint remained constant, its position fixed on that sacred spot where vapours rose from the earth. Around it, the excavators found thousands of objects, bronze tripods dedicated by grateful cities, stone slabs carved with hymns to Apollo, treasuries built by Athens and Thebes and Corinth to house their offerings, the great theatre where thousands had gathered for sacred festivals, and further down the slope, the stadium where athletic competitions honoured the god. The world watched as Delphi emerged from the earth. Newspapers carried reports of each discovery. Scholars travelled from across Europe to see the ruins with their own eyes. Photographers set up their heavy cameras to capture images of columns rising against the mountain backdrop, of inscriptions being carefully cleaned and recorded, of the ancient stones glowing golden in the Mediterranean sun. After centuries of sleep, after generations of forgetting, the Oracle Sanctuary was revealing itself again, stone by stone, inscription by inscription, story by story, ready to share its secrets with a modern world hungry for connection to its ancient past. The scholarly world received the Delphi excavations with a mixture of excitement and doubt that perfectly captured the tensions of late 19th century archaeology. On one hand, here was tangible proof of the sanctuary that had dominated Greek religious and political life for nearly 1,000 years. On the other hand, the very idea that educated, sophisticated ancient Greeks had genuinely believed a priestess could channel divine prophecy struck many European academics as embarrassingly primitive, a superstition unworthy of the people who had invented democracy and philosophy. The rationalist scholars, those who approached ancient religion with barely concealed condescension, argued that the oracle must have been an elaborate fraud. They suggested the priests of Delphi had run an information-gathering network, collecting intelligence from across the Mediterranean and using that knowledge to craft prophecies that seemed divinely inspired. After all, Delphi's priests did maintain relationships with cities throughout the Greek world. They did receive embassies from foreign powers. Perhaps they were simply clever politicians wearing religious robes, manipulating credulous pilgrims for profit and influence. This interpretation pleased those who wanted ancient Greece to be a precursor to modern secular rationalism, a civilization that had moved beyond primitive superstition toward enlightenment. If the oracle was merely political theatre, then the Greeks could remain the intellectual heroes of Western civilization, not people who genuinely believed in prophetic trances and divine possession. The archaeologists working at the site could read these attitudes in the letters they received, in the journal articles that discussed their findings, in the subtle implications that they were wasting time and money excavating a site dedicated to ancient charlatans. But others responded differently. The artifacts themselves, the thousands of dedications and thank offerings, the elaborate treasuries built by grateful cities, the careful architectural attention paid to every detail of the sanctuary, all of this suggested profound, sincere belief. These were not the remnants of a confidence game. These were the material traces of faith, of desperate hope, of genuine conviction that here, at Delphi, the divine broke through into human affairs. The inscriptions told their own story. Stone after stone bore witness to gratitude, to prophecies fulfilled, to divine guidance that had saved cities from disaster or led generals to victory. The Athenians had dedicated a treasury to commemorate their victory at Marathon, attributing their success to Apollo's favour. The people of various cities had sent elaborate bronze tripods, the traditional offering to Apollo, after the god's prophecies had proven accurate. These were not the actions of people who knew they were being duped. These were the actions of believers, of people whose worldview included divine intervention as a matter of simple fact. The excavators themselves, working daily among the ruins, felt the site's power. Théophile Homol wrote letters describing the strange atmosphere of the temple terrace, the way sound carried oddly among the rocks, the curious sense of presence that seemed to linger in certain spots. His workers, local Greeks hired to move earth and stone, spoke matter-of-factly about the place's lingering sanctity, about not wanting to dig at certain hours, about feeling watched. These modern Greeks, whether Christian or secular, still sensed something in the landscape, some quality that made the ancient choice of this location comprehensible. Photographers struggled to capture what made Delphi unique. Their images showed impressive ruins, certainly, columns and foundations and architectural details. But the pictures could not convey the site's peculiar intensity, the way the mountain peaks framed the sanctuary, the dramatic gorge falling away to the valley below, the sense of standing at a threshold between earth and something beyond earth. Visitors who made the journey, who climbed the mountainside and stood where the ancient temple had risen, often reported feeling moved in ways they had not anticipated, touched by something they could not quite name or explain. The debate between skeptics and believers played out in academic journals and popular magazines, in lecture halls and museum galleries. Was Delphi evidence of ancient wisdom or ancient gullibility? Were the Greeks who consulted the Oracle sophisticated people making rational use of available information sources, or superstitious primitives bowing before a woman breathing volcanic fumes? The question mattered because it shaped how Europeans understood their own cultural inheritance, whether they saw themselves as descendants of enlightened philosophers or reformed pagans. But perhaps the real answer lay somewhere the 19th century debaters could not quite see. Perhaps the Oracle had been both genuine religious experience and practical political institution, both sincere faith and sophisticated statecraft, both divine mystery and human interpretation. Perhaps the Greeks themselves had understood their relationship with the Oracle in ways more complex and nuanced than either the skeptics or the true believers of modern times could easily comprehend. The ruins could not settle these questions. The stones could only testify that something powerful had happened here, something that had drawn people across dangerous seas and through hostile territories, something they believed was worth gold and silver and desperate hope. The ancient sources painted the Oracle in such dramatic terms that reconciling their accounts with archaeological evidence proved endlessly challenging. According to legend, the Pythia sat upon a golden tripod placed directly over a chasm in the earth, breathing vapours that rose from Apollo's sacred spring far below. These pneuma, as the Greeks called them, these divine breaths, threw her into ecstatic trance. Her eyes rolled back, her body convulsed, words poured from her mouth in wild, incoherent streams that the priests then carefully translated into the measured hexameter verse that pilgrims received as official prophecy. But the excavators found no chasm. The temple floor, carefully exposed and documented, showed no crack wide enough for vapours to rise through. The ancient writers had described a dramatic geological feature, a cleft in the rock from which sacred gases emerged, but the archaeology revealed only solid limestone bedrock beneath the temple's foundation. This contradiction troubled everyone involved. Either the ancient sources were wrong, or the excavators were missing something, or the truth lay somewhere between legend and physical evidence. The question of the vapours became particularly contentious. What exactly had the Pythia breathed? Some scholars suggested ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas that could produce euphoric effects and altered consciousness. Others proposed that the vapours were entirely mythical, a dramatic detail added to stories to explain the Pythia's trance state. Perhaps she simply performed her role, entering a self-induced trance through meditation or rhythmic breathing, and the vapour story was religious window dressing, a way to make her prophetic state seem more divinely caused. Geological surveys of the area revealed fault lines running beneath the sanctuary, places where the Earth's crust had fractured, creating potential pathways for gases to reach the surface. The sanctuary sat at the intersection of two major faults, the Kerner and Delphi faults, which could indeed have released gases from deep within the Earth. But did these gases actually emerge in the temple's inner chamber? Did they carry psychoactive properties? The geology suggested possibility but could not confirm certainty. The ancient descriptions also contradicted each other in telling ways. Early sources portrayed the Pythia as a wild, possessed figure, speaking in tongues, her prophecies unintelligible without priestly interpretation. Later sources described a more controlled process, the Pythia speaking clearly, even delivering verse herself. Some accounts mentioned only one Pythia serving at a time. Others indicated multiple women, taking turns, serving in rotation when the oracle was particularly busy. These inconsistencies suggested either evolving practices over the centuries or different writers describing what they had heard rather than what they had witnessed. The question of who could become Pythia revealed another layer of contradiction. Some sources insisted she must be a virgin, a young woman unsullied by marriage or childbirth, pure enough to receive the god's presence. But other accounts mentioned that the Pythia was a mature woman, often older, sometimes a widow, chosen for her wisdom and stability rather than her virginity. One story told of a young, beautiful Pythia who had been assaulted by a pilgrim, after which the priest decreed that the Pythia must be over 50 years old, dressed in maidens' clothing but safe from male desire by virtue of age. The frequency of prophecy also puzzled researchers. Popular imagination held that pilgrims could visit Delphi year-round, receiving divine guidance whenever they arrived. But the evidence suggested the oracle operated only on specific days, primarily on the 7th day of certain months, the day sacred to Apollo. During the winter months, Apollo was said to leave Delphi entirely, travelling to the land of the Hyperboreans in the far north, and during his absence the oracle fell silent. This meant pilgrims often had to wait, sometimes for weeks, before they could pose their questions. The nature of the questions themselves contradicted the popular image of the oracle. Modern people often imagine desperate individuals asking life or death questions, seeking guidance about love or illness or impending disaster. The preserved oracle responses, however, dealt largely with ritual and religious protocol. Cities asked where they should establish new colonies. Communities inquired about proper sacrifices to appease angry gods. Generals sought confirmation that their battle plans had divine approval. These were important matters, certainly, but they were corporate, political, religious questions, not the personal, intimate queries of individual suffering. Perhaps the greatest contradiction lay in the oracle's reputation for ambiguity versus evidence of her practical accuracy. The famous stories, Croesus being told he would destroy a great empire if he attacked Persia, only to destroy his own, the Athenians advised to trust in wooden walls before the Persian invasion, these carefully ambiguous prophecies could be interpreted multiple ways, allowing the oracle to seem right regardless of outcomes. Yet cities continued consulting Delphi for centuries, paying substantial fees, offering valuable dedications, treating the prophecies as genuinely useful guidance. Would sophisticated Greek city-states have maintained such devotion to an oracle that only spoke in useless riddles? The contradiction suggested that most prophecies must have been more straightforward than the famous ambiguous ones that became legendary. The ruins could not resolve these contradictions. The stones testified to belief, to investment, to centuries of pilgrimage and devotion, but they could not explain exactly what happened in that inner chamber, how the Pythia achieved her trance, whether gods genuinely spoke or human psychology created the experience of divine encounter. The gap between ancient description and modern evidence remained, a space where mystery still lived. The academic debates about Delphi's oracle split roughly into 3 camps, each convinced they had grasped the essential truth, each dismissive of the other's interpretations. These were not merely scholarly disagreements about historical details. These were fundamental conflicts about how to understand religious experience, about the relationship between belief and reality, about what it meant that rational Greeks had trusted an entranced woman to guide their most important decisions. The rationalist camp, dominant in late 19th century European universities, insisted on purely political and economic explanations. To these scholars, the oracle was a sophisticated information hub, nothing more. The priests of Delphi maintained contacts throughout the Greek world, received embassies from foreign powers, gathered intelligence about wars, harvests, political conflicts, and trade disruptions. When pilgrims arrived seeking prophecy, the priests simply synthesized available information and presented it as divine guidance. The Pythia herself was a talented actress, trained to perform trance states, her role purely theatrical. The vapours, if they existed at all, were stage effects, religious atmosphere to maintain the illusion of divine possession. This interpretation satisfied those who wanted ancient Greece to align with modern rationalism. It made the oracle comprehensible in secular terms, reduced religious experience to cynical manipulation, and preserved the Greeks as essentially modern people trapped in a pre-scientific worldview. The theory's proponents pointed to evidence of the sanctuary's wealth, the priest's political connections, the oracle's tendency to favour cities that made generous offerings. Delphi was a business, they argued, and prophecy was its product, carefully crafted to maintain customer loyalty while avoiding testable claims. The mystical camp took the opposite approach, arguing that something genuinely supernatural occurred at Delphi, that the oracle represented authentic contact with divine or spiritual forces. These scholars, often more sympathetic to religious experience, emphasized the geological evidence of gas emissions, the Pythia's reported trance states, the consistency of prophetic accuracy over centuries. They suggested that certain individuals, particularly women, possessed natural sensitivity to altered states of consciousness, and that the vapours enhanced this innate psychic ability. The Pythia was not performing, she was channeling, opening herself to forces beyond ordinary perception. This interpretation troubled the rationalists, who saw it as abandoning scholarly rigour for New Age mysticism. Yet its proponents argued that dismissing all religious experience as fraud or delusion meant ignoring vast swathes of human history and psychology. People across cultures and centuries had reported genuine encounters with what they experienced as divine or transcendent reality. Was it more scholarly to dismiss these experiences as uniformly false, or to take them seriously as real psychological and spiritual phenomena, whatever their ultimate source? The third camp, perhaps most interesting, argued for a middle position grounded in ancient psychology and altered consciousness. These scholars suggested the Pythia genuinely entered trance states, but through natural psychological mechanisms rather than either divine possession or cynical fraud. Rhythmic breathing, sensory deprivation, expectation, and possibly mild intoxication from burning laurel leaves or other substances could produce dissociative states. In such states, the unconscious mind gained greater voice, allowing the Pythia to speak with a kind of intuitive wisdom uncensored by ordinary rational thought. This interpretation drew on emerging understanding of psychology, hypnosis, and altered states of consciousness. It allowed the oracle to be both genuine and natural, neither supernatural miracle nor deliberate deception. The Pythia believed she channeled Apollo. The pilgrims believed they received divine guidance. The priests believed they served the god's purposes. Everyone involved was sincere, but what they experienced as divine possession was actually a complex psychological phenomenon, one that could genuinely produce valuable insights through accessing deeper layers of perception and intuition. Each theory struggled with certain evidence while explaining other aspects neatly. The rationalist interpretation could not account for why sophisticated Greeks continued consulting the oracle for centuries if it was obviously fraudulent. The mystical interpretation had no way to address the oracle's failures. The Times prophecies proved dramatically wrong, or when client cities ignored Delphic advice with no apparent divine punishment. The psychological interpretation elegantly explained the mechanism, but struggled to account for specific, verifiable prophecies about events the Pythia could not have known about through any normal means. Perhaps most tellingly, these same three interpretive camps appeared whenever scholars discussed other ancient oracles, mystery religions, or prophetic traditions. The debates about Delphi were really debates about how to understand religious experience generally, about whether the proper scholarly stance was skeptical reduction, sympathetic openness, or some middle ground that took both belief and evidence seriously. The Greek pilgrims who had climbed to Delphi, who had paid their fees and made their offerings and waited their turn to approach the oracle, these people had not needed theories. They had needed answers, needed hope, needed the assurance that their questions mattered enough that the gods would respond. Whether Apollo genuinely spoke, whether the Pythia channeled divine wisdom or human intuition, whether the priests managed information or served transcendent purposes, these debates would have seemed beside the point to someone standing before the temple, heart-pounding, question-burning, waiting to hear what the god would say. The theories could explain or dismiss or reframe, but they could not capture the lived experience of someone seeking divine guidance at the navel of the world. The early 20th century brought new scientific tools to the question of what had actually happened at Delphi. geologists began seriously investigating the fault lines beneath the sanctuary, employing increasingly sophisticated methods to understand the mountain's structure. Chemists analysed soil samples from the temple site, searching for traces of gases that might have emerged from underground. Archaeologists expanded their excavations, carefully documenting every layer of the sanctuary's long history, looking for physical evidence that might illuminate the oracle's methods. In the temple's inner sanctum, the Adyton, where the Pythia had delivered her prophecies, excavators found a rectangular space about 9 feet by 12 feet, surprisingly small for a room that had changed the course of history. The floor showed evidence of multiple rebuildings, each temple faithful to the last in maintaining this chamber's exact position and orientation. This consistency across centuries of reconstruction suggested the spot itself mattered, that something about this precise location was considered essential to the oracle's function. Beneath the temple floor, geological surveys revealed a complex network of fractures and fissures in the limestone bedrock. These faults, active and occasionally producing small tremors, could indeed have served as conduits for gases rising from deeper within the earth. The Delphi fault zone, where 2 major geological systems intersected, showed signs of releasing hydrocarbon gases, including ethylene and methane. Analysis of ancient travertine deposits, the stone formed by mineral-rich spring water, revealed chemical signatures consistent with gas emissions at the site. The pieces began fitting together into a more coherent picture. The geological evidence supported the ancient claims about vapours, even if no single dramatic chasm existed. The gases would have emerged subtly, seeping upward through multiple small cracks, particularly during periods of seismic activity. The temple's repeated destruction by earthquake made sense in this context, built as it was directly over an active fault zone. The Greeks had not chosen Delphi despite its geological instability, but because of it, interpreting the earth's rumbling and the sweet-smelling gases as signs of divine presence. Ethnographic studies of trance practices in other cultures provided additional context. Anthropologists documented dozens of societies where religious specialists entered altered states to deliver prophecy or channel divine messages. The methods varied: rhythmic drumming, dancing, fasting, sensory deprivation, hallucinogenic substances, but the underlying pattern repeated across continents and centuries. Humans possessed a nearly universal capacity for dissociative states, and many cultures interpreted these states as moments when the boundary between human and divine grew permeable. The Pythia's preparation ritual, preserved in scattered ancient accounts, began to make more sense when viewed through this comparative lens. Before prophecy sessions, she bathed in the Castalian, spring, water so cold it must have shocked the system, heightening alertness while clearing the mind. She drank from another sacred spring, the Cassotes, whose waters the Greeks believed conferred prophetic power. She chewed laurel leaves, sacred to Apollo, which might have contained mild psychoactive compounds. She entered the temple in a state of ritual purity, having fasted, her body prepared through deprivation and anticipation. Inside the Adyton, she sat upon the tripod, a bronze seat positioned over the spot where vapours emerged most strongly. The enclosed space, small and dark, would have concentrated any gases present. The combination of psychological preparation, physiological stress from fasting and cold water bathing, possible mild intoxication from laurel leaves, and exposure to ethylene gas would have created powerful conditions for altered consciousness. The Pythia was not simply pretending or performing. She was engaging in a sophisticated, time-tested technique for achieving trance states. Historical analysis of preserved oracle responses revealed patterns that supported neither the pure fraud theory nor the mystical interpretation. Most prophecies were straightforward, practical answers to ritual questions. Should we found a colony? Yes, at such and such location. Which god should we sacrifice to for good harvest? Apollo, with the following offerings. Is now a good time to begin war? Wait until autumn. These responses required judgment and knowledge, but not supernatural insight. They were the kind of advice that experienced, well-informed priests could reasonably provide. But a smaller number of prophecies showed remarkable specificity about future events or distant situations that seemed beyond any normal means of knowing. These were the responses that had built Delphi's reputation, the uncannily accurate predictions that convinced cities to trust the oracle with their most important decisions. Were these lucky guesses, information acquired through espionage, or moments when the Pythia's altered state genuinely accessed deeper intuitive knowledge? The investigation could not definitively answer this question, but it could at least frame it more precisely. Archaeological evidence showed the oracle evolved over time. Early practices differed from later ones. The first Pythia had probably operated more informally, her prophecies less mediated by priestly interpretation. As Delphi's reputation grew, as pilgrims came from further away, as the political stakes increased, the institution became more structured, more careful, more diplomatic in its responses. The human organization adapted while maintaining the core experience at its center. The woman on the tripod, breathing sacred vapors, speaking words that others would record and interpret and carry away as divine truth. The material evidence scattered across Delphi's sanctuary told stories that ancient texts could only hint at. Thousands of inscriptions carved into stone preserved the voices of grateful cities, successful generals, relieved merchants, all testifying to prophecies fulfilled and divine guidance received. These were not anonymous dedications. These were named individuals and identified communities, their gratitude recorded permanently for all to witness, their willingness to associate themselves publicly with the oracle's accuracy. The treasury buildings, small temple-like structures lining the sacred way, represented staggering investments. The Athenian treasury, its marble blocks carefully fitted without mortar, had been constructed after the Battle of Marathon in 490, before the Common Era. Its friezes depicted the labours of Heracles and the deeds of Theseus, Athens' legendary founder. Inside, the Athenians had stored precious offerings, bronze shields taken from defeated Persians, gold crowns won in athletic competitions, valuable dedications accumulating over centuries. This was not the behaviour of a city that believed it had been consulting charlatans. This was the behaviour of a community that credited the oracle with helping save it from destruction. Similar treasuries rose from the foundations in excavation after excavation. The Siphnians, from that small but wealthy Aegean island, had built the most elaborate structure, its entrance guarded by 2 marble maidens, its friezes showing gods battling giants in extraordinary sculptural detail. The Siphnian treasury dated to 525 before the Common Era, and ancient sources recorded that the island's silver mines had run so rich that the citizens consulted Delphi about how to manage their sudden wealth. The oracle had advised them to dedicate a tenth to Apollo, and they had built this magnificent treasury to house their thanks. The bronze tripods, hundreds of them dedicated over centuries, spoke to the oracle's central symbol. These 3-legged bronze vessels, some simple, some elaborately decorated with griffin heads and spiral handles, had been the traditional offering to Apollo since the earliest days. Winners of athletic competitions dedicated their prize tripods to the god. Cities sent tripods after military victories. Individuals offered tripods in thanks for personal prophecies fulfilled. The excavators found fragments of these dedications scattered across the site. Bronze oxidized green with age, inscriptions identifying donors from Sicily to the Black Sea coast. The inscriptions themselves provided a detailed record of who consulted the oracle and why. Cities asked about establishing colonies, recording the oracle's guidance about where to settle and which heroes to honour. Communities inquired about religious reforms, documenting Apollo's advice about festival schedules and proper sacrifices. Individuals, usually wealthy enough to afford private consultations, left records of questions about marriage, business ventures, and civic duties. These inscriptions demonstrated that the oracle handled an enormous volume of consultations, functioning as a religious United Nations, a central institution where Greek communities sought divine sanction for major decisions. The sacred way itself, that processional route climbing from the sanctuary's lower entrance to Apollo's temple on the upper terrace, demonstrated the competitive nature of Greek religion. Each city-state wanted its treasury positioned prominently, wanted its dedications to be the most impressive, wanted other Greeks to see their piety and wealth and divine favour. The pathway was a stage where cities performed their relationships with the gods, each trying to outdo the others in displays of devotion and thanksgiving. Walking this route, pilgrims passed through a gallery of Greek achievement, each monument declaring Apollo's favour for particular communities. The athletic stadium, positioned on the mountainside above the temple, testified to another aspect of Delphic religion. Every 4 years, the Pythian Games brought athletes from across the Greek world to compete in honour of Apollo. These games, second only to the Olympics in prestige, included not just running and wrestling but musical competitions, poetry recitations and dramatic performances. Winners received laurel crowns and the glory of victory at Delphi, a prestige that followed them home and elevated their status in their native cities. The theatre, its limestone seats carved into the mountainside's natural slope, could hold 5,000 spectators. Here, during the great festivals, choruses performed hymns to Apollo, actors staged dramas, poets competed for prizes. Music and poetry and drama were not peripheral to the sanctuary's religious function. They were central to it, expressions of the same creative divine energy that spoke through the Pythia's prophecies. Apollo was god of prophecy, but he was also god of music, of poetry, of the arts that elevated human consciousness toward the divine. The artifacts recovered from various excavations included objects of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. Bronze statues of young men, Kouros figures stood in eternal devotion to the god. Marble women, Korai, smiled their archaic smiles, their painted clothing still showing traces of red and blue pigment. Gold jewellery, ivory carvings, precious vessels of silver and bronze all testified to the wealth that flowed through Delphi, to the oracle's position at the centre of Greek economic as well as religious life. But perhaps the most moving artefacts were the simplest ones, small terracotta figurines left by ordinary pilgrims who could not afford gold and silver. These simple clay animals, tiny human figures, rough pottery vessels, they represented the offerings of farmers and craftspeople, of the Greek majority whose questions might not have been recorded in grand inscriptions, but who also sought the god's guidance. These humble dedications showed that Delphi belonged not just to the rich and powerful, but to anyone who could make the journey and afford even the smallest offering. Beneath the public face of Delphi's oracle, beneath the recorded consultations and magnificent dedications, lay a deeper mystery that ancient sources only rarely acknowledged. The oracle was not merely a fortune-telling service for cities and individuals, it was the guardian of something more profound, the keeper of secrets that shaped Greek civilization in ways that surface history never fully captured. The oracle's influence on colonization revealed this hidden dimension. Between 750 and 550 before the Common Era, Greek cities sent out hundreds of colonial expeditions, establishing settlements around the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. Nearly every one of these expeditions consulted Delphi first, seeking the god's approval and guidance about where to settle. But the oracle's responses did more than simply bless existing plans. They actively directed the pattern of Greek expansion, steering colonies towards specific locations, dictating which heroes the settlers should honour, establishing the religious framework that would bind distant colonies to their mother cities. This was social engineering on a massive scale. The oracle functioned as a central planning authority for Greek colonization, ensuring that new settlements maintained cultural and religious connections to the Greek heartland. By requiring colonial founders to return and consult Delphi, by mandating that colonies send offerings and maintain ties to Apollo's sanctuary, the oracle created a network that kept far-flung Greek communities connected. This was not merely religious authority. This was the creation of a shared Greek identity that could survive geographic dispersion. The oracle's role in legal and constitutional reform went equally deep. When cities faced internal conflicts, when traditional laws no longer served changed circumstances, when civil strife threatened to tear communities apart, they consulted Delphi. The oracle's responses often recommended specific legal reforms, constitutional changes, or ritual innovations that addressed underlying social tensions. The oracle helped resolve disputes that might otherwise have erupted into civil war, lending divine authority to legal innovations that pure human argument might not have been able to legitimate. Sparta's entire constitution, according to tradition, had been given by the Delphic oracle. The Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus, perhaps legendary rather than historical, had supposedly travelled to Delphi and received from Apollo the laws that would govern Sparta for centuries. Whether or not this story was literally true, it demonstrated how Greeks understood the oracle's function, not as passive answering of questions, but as active shaping of social order, providing divine sanction for human institutions that might otherwise lack legitimacy. The oracle also guarded dangerous knowledge, determining what could be safely revealed and what must remain hidden. The priests of Delphi maintained an extensive library, collections of prophecies and historical records that traced patterns across generations. They knew which families were cursed, which bloodlines carried inherited guilt, which cities harboured ancient crimes that might require ritual purification. This knowledge gave them extraordinary power, the ability to explain disasters as divine punishment for forgotten offences, to demand ritual actions that could reshape political situations under religious guise. The concept of inherited guilt, passed down through generations, permeated Greek thinking, and the Delphic oracle both reinforced and managed this belief. Families could be cursed for crimes committed by distant ancestors. Cities could suffer plague or famine or military defeat because of ancient sacrilege. Only the oracle could definitively diagnose such spiritual problems and prescribe the rituals needed to resolve them. This gave Delphi enormous influence over Greek political life, the ability to declare that a city's troubles stemmed not from bad policy or bad luck, but from religious pollution requiring specific remedies. The oracle's relationship with women revealed another hidden layer. The Pythia was female, always female, in a culture that otherwise excluded women from public religious and political authority. Why? Some scholars suggested this was a survival from earlier goddess worship, that Delphi's original deity had been Gaia, the Earth Mother, and the female priestess preserved this ancient tradition even after Apollo claimed the site. Others argued that women were considered more naturally suited to divine possession, more open to the loss of self required for the god to speak through them. But perhaps the deeper truth was that the Pythia's gender placed her outside normal Greek social structures, made her a liminal figure who could transcend the partisan conflicts that divided male citizens. She was not wife, not mother, not daughter in her prophetic role. She was simply the god's voice, her individual identity subsumed into divine presence. This allowed her words to carry authority that no male priest could claim, precisely because she occupied a unique social position, unconstrained by the usual expectations and conflicts of gendered existence. The oracle also shaped Greek theology in subtle ways, determining which gods to honour in particular circumstances, which ritual innovations were acceptable, which foreign deities could be incorporated into Greek religion. As Greek culture encountered other civilizations, as new gods and religious practices became known, questions arose about how to integrate this knowledge without compromising traditional piety. The oracle served as theological arbiter, its pronouncements determining what was religiously permissible and what constituted dangerous impiety. Perhaps most significantly, the oracle shaped how Greeks thought about fate and free will. Its prophecies suggested the future was knowable, at least by the gods, yet Greeks still believed humans bore responsibility for their choices. This tension between destiny and agency ran through Greek thought, and the oracle stood at its centre. Could the future be changed by knowing it in advance? Did consulting the oracle give mortals a chance to avoid fate, or did it simply ensure that fate unfolded as destined? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They were lived dilemmas for anyone who received a prophecy, and then had to decide how to act on that knowledge. The turning point came not as a single dramatic moment, but as a cascade of events spanning decades in the late 6th and early 5th centuries before the Common Era. The oracle had reached the height of its influence, its authority acknowledged from Sicily to the Black Sea. Cities competed for its favour. Kings sought its blessing. The priests of Apollo commanded wealth and prestige unprecedented in Greek religious history. And then the Persian Empire, the greatest power the ancient world had yet seen, turned its attention toward Greece, and suddenly the oracle faced questions that would test its credibility to the breaking point. The first crisis began with Croesus, king of Lydia, whose kingdom in western Anatolia stood as a buffer between the Greek cities of the coast and the rising power of Persia. Croesus was legendarily wealthy, the source of the phrase rich as Croesus, and he was a devoted patron of Delphi, sending magnificent offerings, dedicating treasuries, consulting the oracle on matters great and small. Around 550 before the Common Era, he faced a crucial decision. The Persian king Cyrus was expanding westward. Should Croesus attack first, or wait and hope diplomacy might preserve his kingdom? Croesus sent embassies to Delphi with lavish offerings and a straightforward question. If he attacked Persia, what would happen? The oracle's response became infamous for its ambiguity. If Croesus crossed the river Halys, marking the border between his kingdom and Persian territory, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, hearing what he wanted to hear, interpreted this as promise of victory. He attacked. He was utterly defeated. The great empire he destroyed was his own. This disaster should have ruined the oracle's reputation. A king who had been perhaps Delphi's most generous patron had been led to catastrophic defeat by following prophecy. Yet somehow the oracle emerged unscathed, its ambiguous phrasing allowing supporters to argue that technically the prophecy had been accurate. Croesus had destroyed a great empire, just not the one he expected. The oracle had not lied, they insisted. It had simply revealed truth in a way that required wisdom to interpret correctly. But worse tests followed. In 490 before the Common Era, the Persians invaded Greece proper, landing at Marathon to punish Athens for supporting a Greek revolt in Asia Minor. The Athenians consulted Delphi, desperate for divine guidance. Should they flee their city, stand and fight, seek terms with the Persians? The oracle's initial response was bleak. Athens would fall. Fire would consume the city. The gods themselves could not prevent what was coming. The Athenian ambassadors refused to accept this answer. They remained at the sanctuary, performing additional sacrifices, pleading for better guidance. Finally, the oracle spoke again. Athens should trust in wooden walls. Only wooden walls would save them. This second prophecy was barely less obscure than the first. What did wooden walls mean? Some Athenians argued it meant the wooden palisade around the Acropolis, Athens's ancient citadel. They should retreat there and make their last stand. Others insisted it meant ships, Athens' growing navy. They should evacuate the city and fight at sea. The debate split Athens. The oracle had spoken, but its words required interpretation, and interpretation depended on who stood to benefit from which reading. The wealthy conservatives favoured defending the Acropolis, maintaining traditional ways. The more radical Democrats, led by Themistocles, pushed for the naval interpretation, which required abandoning the city to Persian occupation, while the fleet sought victory at sea. This was the oracle at its most characteristic, providing guidance that was simultaneously divine authority and blank canvas for political projection. Athens chose the ships. The Persian king Xerxes invaded in 480 before the Common Era with an army that ancient sources numbered in the millions, though modern estimates suggest perhaps 200,000. The Greeks, badly outnumbered, fell back. The Spartan king Leonidas made his famous stand at Thermopylae, buying time with his death. Athens was evacuated. The Persians occupied the city and burned the temples on the Acropolis exactly as the oracle had predicted. And then, in the narrow waters off Salamis Island, the Greek fleet shattered the Persian navy, turning the tide of the war. The wooden walls had saved Athens after all, though at the cost of seeing their city destroyed. The oracle's reputation emerged enhanced rather than damaged. It had warned of destruction that could not be prevented, then provided the key to ultimate victory. The ambiguity that might have been weakness became proof of profound wisdom, knowledge so deep it required careful interpretation to access fully. These Persian wars marked the moment when the oracle transcended being merely one religious sanctuary among many and became the acknowledged spiritual centre of Greek civilization. The victories over Persia were credited partly to divine favour, and Delphi stood as the primary mediator of that favour. Cities sent dedications after every victory. Athens built its treasury and filled it with Persian spoils. The sanctuary gleamed with gold and bronze, testament to its role in Greek survival. But the very success brought new pressures. The oracle now carried weight in every major Greek political decision. Its pronouncements could determine war or peace, shape alliances, legitimate constitutional changes. The priests found themselves at the centre of Greek power politics, their neutrality constantly tested, their authority both resource and burden. They had reached the apex of influence, and from such heights there was nowhere to go but down. Victory over Persia transformed Greece, and in that transformation, the oracle's position grew increasingly precarious. The unity that had held Greek cities together against external threat dissolved into rivalry and competition once the common enemy had been expelled. Athens and Sparta, the two cities that had contributed most to Persian defeat, found themselves on collision course toward conflict that would eventually tear the Greek world apart. And Delphi, trying to maintain its position as neutral arbiter and divine authority, found itself drawn into partisan politics that no amount of religious prestige could transcend. The problem began with success. Greek cities, grateful for victory, poured wealth into Delphi. New treasuries rose. New dedications crowded the sacred way. New colonies sent offerings. The sanctuary became richer than ever, but wealth brought corruption and suspicion. Cities began to whisper that prophecies could be bought, that generous offerings influenced the oracle's responses, that the priests had become politicians in religious robes, serving whoever paid most generously. The Athenian historian Thucydides, writing later in the 5th century, expressed the skepticism that was growing among educated Greeks. He rarely mentioned oracles in his history of the Peloponnesian War, the great conflict between Athens and Sparta that dominated the last third of the century. When he did mention prophecy, his tone was dry, almost dismissive. For Thucydides, human decisions and power dynamics explained historical events. The gods, if they intervened at all, did so rarely and without clear pattern. This shift in Greek intellectual life struck at the heart of the oracle's authority. The sophists, those travelling teachers who questioned everything, encouraged their students to analyse prophecy rationally, to look for the human motivations behind religious pronouncements, to recognise ambiguity as protective vagueness rather than divine wisdom. The philosophers went further. Socrates, teaching in Athens in the late 5th century, claimed a personal divine voice, a daimon that guided him directly without need for institutional intermediaries like the oracle. This was radical, suggesting that individuals could access divine guidance without priests, without oracles, without the expensive apparatus of established religion. Yet even as intellectuals questioned the oracle's divine authority, cities continued consulting Delphi. This was partly tradition, partly the legitimacy that divine sanction provided for controversial decisions, partly genuine belief that persisted despite philosophical doubts. The oracle adapted, becoming more careful in its pronouncements, more diplomatic in navigating Greek political conflicts, more aware that its reputation depended on not being demonstrably wrong too often. The sacred wars revealed how completely the oracle had become entangled in Greek politics. The first sacred war, fought in the early 6th century, had concerned control of Delphi and the lucrative revenue it generated. The second sacred war in 448 before the Common Era saw Sparta briefly control the sanctuary, before Athens seized it back. These were not religious conflicts in any pure sense. These were power struggles over a valuable asset, fought under religious pretext but driven by political and economic motives. The oracle's responses during these conflicts pleased no one fully. When it tried to remain neutral, both sides accused it of cowardice. When it favoured one side, the other claimed corruption. The priests found themselves in an impossible position, their every word scrutinised for bias, their authority dependent on maintaining at least the appearance of divine objectivity in situations where objectivity was impossible. The Peloponnesian War, beginning in 431 before the Common Era, put the oracle under unprecedented pressure. Athens and Sparta both needed divine legitimacy for their actions, both consulted Delphi, both expected favourable responses. The oracle, trying to preserve its position, often gave answers that could be interpreted multiple ways, that seemed to support both sides or neither, that maintained ambiguity as protective coloration. This may have been wise policy, but it further eroded the oracle's reputation for clear divine guidance. Epidemics added to the crisis. Plague struck Athens early in the war, killing perhaps a third of the population including the great leader Pericles. People asked why the gods would allow such suffering. They asked why the oracle had not warned them. They asked whether divine protection meant anything if the pious died alongside the impious, if offering sacrifices and consulting prophets made no difference to survival. The plague raised theological questions that traditional Greek religion struggled to answer convincingly. The old certainties were crumbling. In earlier generations, Greeks had believed that piety ensured divine favour, that impiety brought divine punishment, that the world operated according to principles of religious justice. But the late 5th century showed good people suffering and wicked people prospering, showed cities that honoured the gods being destroyed while impious cities triumphed, showed that consulting oracles and making offerings guaranteed nothing. This cognitive dissonance pushed Greek thought in new directions, toward philosophy that sought ethical principles independent of divine command, toward history that explained events through human agency rather than supernatural intervention. Yet Delphi endured. Cities still came, still asked questions, still left offerings. The oracle still spoke, still shaped decisions, still commanded enough authority that its words mattered. But something had changed fundamentally. The easy confidence was gone. The unquestioned divine authority had eroded. The oracle had become one voice among many, influential but no longer supreme, respected but no longer beyond criticism. The fall from divine certainty to human institution had begun, a slow decline that would continue for centuries until eventually a very different kind of empire would close the sanctuary forever. The oracle's influence on Western civilization extended far beyond its immediate religious function. Delphi shaped how Greeks thought about knowledge itself, about the relationship between human wisdom and divine truth, about the possibility of glimpsing the future and the responsibility that came with such glimpses. These intellectual and spiritual contributions echoed through Greek philosophy, literature, and politics, eventually flowing into Roman culture, and from there into the foundations of European thought. The most famous inscription at Delphi, carved into Apollo's temple, consisted of just 2 words in Greek, "Know thyself." This maxim, attributed to various ancient sages but permanently associated with Apollo's sanctuary, became central to Greek philosophical tradition. Socrates made it the foundation of his teaching. True wisdom, he argued, began with recognizing the limits of one's knowledge, understanding one's own ignorance, seeing clearly the boundary between what could be known through reason and what remained mysterious. This was not pessimism about human capabilities. It was realistic assessment of human limitation combined with commitment to pursuing knowledge despite those limits. The oracle embodied this paradox. It offered knowledge of the future, of divine will, of hidden truth, yet its pronouncements often remained ambiguous, requiring interpretation, testing the questioner's own wisdom. The oracle did not simply provide answers. It challenged those who consulted it to think deeply, to examine their own assumptions, to recognize that even divine guidance required human judgment to apply correctly. This interactive model of revelation, where the divine provided hints and humans had to work out implications, shaped Greek intellectual culture profoundly. Greek drama, particularly tragedy, drew constantly on oracle themes. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, perhaps the greatest Greek tragedy, centered entirely on attempts to avoid an oracle's prophecy, and the terrible irony that those attempts fulfilled the very fate the characters sought to escape. This was not simply entertainment. This was theology in dramatic form, exploring profound questions about fate and free will, about whether human choice mattered if the future was already known, about the tragic consequences of trying to outwit destiny. The concept of tragic irony itself emerged from oracle stories. Characters received true information about the future but misinterpreted it, their own flaws or blindness leading them to understand prophecy in ways that ensured its fulfillment. This pattern appeared in story after story, play after play, becoming a fundamental structure for thinking about human limitation and the gap between appearance and reality. The oracle stories taught that truth could be available yet still misunderstood, that knowledge alone was insufficient without wisdom to interpret it correctly. Political philosophy also bore the oracle's mark. The idea that law required divine sanction, that human institutions needed religious legitimacy to command obedience, that major decisions benefited from ritual consultation of higher authority. All of this flowed partly from Delphic influence. When Plato designed his ideal city in the Republic, when Aristotle analyzed different constitutional forms in his politics, they were working within intellectual frameworks shaped by centuries of Greek cities, consulting oracles about legal and political questions. The oracle's colonization role created lasting geopolitical impacts. The pattern of Greek settlement around the Mediterranean, the locations where colonies were founded, the cultural and religious ties that bound these colonies to their mother cities, all bore the oracle's stamp. Cities in southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa, the Black Sea coasts, All these distant Greek communities maintained connections to Delphi, sent offerings, consulted the oracle about local matters. This created a cultural network that survived political fragmentation, a shared Greek identity that transcended the fierce independence of individual city-states. Roman conquest of Greece might have ended the oracle's influence, but instead Romans adopted and adapted Greek religious institutions. Roman generals consulted Delphi. Roman emperors sent offerings. The Romans respected the sanctuary's antiquity and maintained its operations, seeing it as a connection to the cultural heritage they were absorbing from their Greek subjects. Augustus, the first emperor, gave substantial gifts to Delphi. Nero, for all his notorious excesses, treated the oracle with reverence, at least initially. The oracle's influence on early Christianity was more complex. The early church fathers generally condemned pagan prophecy as demonic deception, yet they could not deny that ancient Greeks had sought divine truth, and sometimes, by Christian accounts, had received genuine glimpses of it. Some Christian writers argued that the oracle had actually prophesied Christ's coming, that certain ambiguous responses could be reinterpreted as predicting Christianity's triumph. This was likely wishful reading, but it demonstrated how difficult it was to completely reject an institution so deeply embedded in cultural memory. The oracle's eventual closure by Christian emperors in the 4th century of the Common Era did not erase its intellectual legacy. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers remained fascinated by Delphi, by the idea that ancient pagans had possessed prophetic knowledge, by the theological puzzles this raised. How could God have allowed a pagan oracle to speak truth? Were the prophecies demonic? Were they merely human wisdom misattributed to gods? These questions drove centuries of commentary and debate. Modern excavations revealed the oracle's physical remains, but its deeper impact lay in the ideas it had fostered, the ways of thinking about knowledge and authority, and the relationship between human and divine that still echoed through Western culture. The notion that major decisions benefit from careful consultation, that multiple perspectives should be considered, that ambiguity in guidance requires active interpretation rather than passive acceptance. All of this carried forward from Delphi into later political and intellectual traditions. Behind the grand narratives of kings consulting oracles and cities, dedicating treasuries stood ordinary people whose lives intersected with Delphi in more intimate, personal ways. These were the pilgrims whose names were never inscribed on monuments, the priests who served year after year in relative obscurity, the women who became Pythia and channeled the god's voice, the craftspeople and merchants whose labour made the sanctuary function. Their stories, largely lost to history, reveal a different, more human dimension to the oracle's operations. Consider the Pythia herself, not as mythological figure or institutional role, but as a living woman. The sources tell us she was usually selected from the women of Delphi or nearby villages, chosen for her good character and stable disposition, rather than any special religious training. She was not a priestess in the sense of having studied theology or undergone years of preparation. She was an ordinary woman, perhaps a farmer's wife or widow, who was selected to perform the most extraordinary religious function in the Greek world. What must it have been like, being chosen as Pythia? To go from tending chickens and spinning wool to sitting on a sacred tripod, breathing vapours, speaking words that would be written down and carried to distant cities as divine commands. Did the women selected feel honoured or terrified? Did they believe they genuinely channeled Apollo, or did they understand themselves as playing a role, performing a function that was partly real religious experience and partly institutional theatre? We know the names of only a handful of Pythias across the centuries. Femino, tradition claimed, was the first, inventing the hexameter verse form that later oracles used. Aristoclea supposedly taught the philosopher Pythagoras. Beyond these legendary figures, the Pythias remained anonymous, their individual identities subsumed into their religious function. This anonymity was perhaps intentional, preserving the sense that it was the god speaking rather than any particular woman. Yet they were women with lives beyond their oracle duties. The Pythia did not live in the temple. She returned home between prophecy sessions, resumed her normal existence, interacted with neighbours who knew her as herself, rather than as Apollo's voice. How did she navigate this dual identity? How did her family regard her? Did her husband, if she had one, feel proud or anxious? Did her children understand their mother's significance, or did they simply see her as someone who occasionally went to work at the temple and came home tired and strange? The priests who served Apollo, managing the sanctuary's operations, interpreting the Pythia's utterances, maintaining relationships with Greek cities, these men came from Delphi's leading families. The position was hereditary, passed from father to son, an aristocracy of religious service. These priests were educated, cultured, politically sophisticated. They needed to be. Their work required diplomatic skill, the ability to frame responses that satisfied questioners without committing the oracle to positions that later events might contradict. These priests walked a constant tightrope between religious authority and political pressure. Cities that came to consult the oracle often had clear expectations about what responses they wanted to hear. Embassies arrived with lavish offerings, with subtle or not so subtle hints about what answer would be appreciated, with veiled threats about what might happen to the sanctuary's reputation if it gave guidance that proved disastrous. The priests had to maintain the oracle's credibility while navigating these pressures, producing prophecies that seemed genuinely divine yet did not needlessly antagonize powerful patrons. The temple servants, those who cleaned and maintained the sanctuary, who prepared the ritual bathing for the Pythia, who managed the sacred springs and laurel groves, these people lived their entire lives in the god's service, yet left no record of their thoughts or experiences. They were invisible to history, mentioned in texts only when something went wrong, when water supplies failed or buildings needed repair. Yet their labour made the oracle possible, maintained the sacred space that drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. The merchants and craftspeople of Delphi itself formed a community that lived off the sanctuary's fame. Innkeepers housed pilgrims, guides led visitors up the sacred way, explaining the monuments and telling stories. Artists and artisans produced votive offerings for those who came without bringing gifts from home, small bronze figurines and clay animals that ordinary pilgrims could afford. Priests for hire performed preliminary sacrifices for those who did not know the proper rituals. This entire economy depended on the oracle's continuing operation, on people believing that the journey to Delphi was worthwhile. Some pilgrims spent weeks at the sanctuary, waiting for their turn to consult the oracle, participating in festivals, making offerings, soaking in the religious atmosphere. Others came and left quickly, driven by urgent need for answers. A merchant whose ships were overdue might travel to Delphi in desperate hope that the god could assure him of their safe return. A young woman, pregnant out of wedlock, might ask the oracle's guidance about what to do, seeking divine sanction for whatever choice she made. A former slave, having purchased his freedom, might dedicate a small offering in thanks to Apollo for guidance that had helped him save enough to buy his freedom. These personal stories, mostly lost, mattered as much as the grand political consultations that made it into historical records. For every king asking about war, there were dozens of ordinary people asking about marriages, illnesses, business ventures, family conflicts. The oracle served them all, the famous and the forgotten, the powerful and the powerless, offering to everyone who could afford the consultation fee the possibility of divine guidance in navigating life's uncertainties. Not everyone accepted the oracle's authority. From its earliest days, Delphi faced skeptics, critics, and opponents who questioned its legitimacy, challenged its pronouncements, or rejected entirely the premise that God spoke through human intermediaries. These voices of resistance, though often marginalized by official histories, reveal the intellectual diversity and critical thinking that coexisted with Greek religious tradition. The earliest recorded skepticism came from within the Greek philosophical tradition itself. Heraclitus of Ephesus, that obscure and difficult philosopher of the late 6th century before the Common Era, had famously declared that the Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither declares nor conceals but gives signs. This was not outright rejection but careful qualification, suggesting that the oracle's responses required interpretation, that they were ambiguous by nature, that treating them as clear divine commands missed their essential character as hints requiring human wisdom to decode. The sophists pushed criticism further. Protagoras, teaching in Athens during the 5th century, claimed that man is the measure of all things, a relativist position that undercut any claim to absolute divine truth. If truth varied by perspective, if human judgment was the ultimate arbiter of value, then what special authority could oracles claim? The sophists taught their students to analyze religious claims critically, to recognize the human interest often hidden behind divine pronouncements, to understand that priests were politicians in sacred robes. Some attacks on the oracle were not philosophical but personal and bitter. The poet Hipponax of Ephesus, exiled from his city in the mid-6th century, cursed the oracle that had advised against his return. His verses mocked the Pythia as a fraud, suggested the priests were corrupt, claimed the whole operation was a scam to extract money from credulous pilgrims. These attacks, crude and angry, probably had little impact on the oracle's reputation, but they demonstrated that even in its heyday, Delphi had enemies willing to speak against it publicly. Political opposition emerged whenever the oracle's responses conflicted with powerful interests. During the Persian Wars, cities that received discouraging prophecies sometimes chose to ignore them entirely, proceeding with their original plans regardless of divine guidance. The Athenians' refusal to accept the oracle's initial dire warnings about Persian invasion, their insistence on additional consultation until they received a response they could work with, this demonstrated that even pious Greeks would push back when prophecy conflicted with what they were determined to do anyway. Some Greek cities established their own oracle sites, competing directly with Delphi's authority. The Oracle of Zeus at Dodona, in northwestern Greece, claimed equal antiquity and divine authorization. Questioners at Dodona wrote their questions on lead tablets that have survived, preserved by the metal's resistance to decay. These tablets show that ordinary people consulted Dodona about the same kinds of personal matters they might have asked Delphi, suggesting the sites competed for clientele. The Oracle of Apollo at Didymar on the coast of Asia Minor served a similar function for Greeks in that region, reducing the need to make the longer, more expensive journey to Delphi. The rise of rational medicine challenged the oracle's role in addressing illness. Hippocrates, the physician whose name became synonymous with medical ethics, taught that diseases had natural causes and natural cures. He argued against attributing illness to divine punishment, or viewing health as primarily a religious matter. This medicalization of illness reduced one major reason people had consulted oracles, replacing divine diagnosis with physical examination and natural remedies. Military defeats sometimes triggered backlash against the oracle. When cities followed Delphic advice and lost battles anyway, when prophecies proved spectacularly wrong, critics seized the opportunity to question the whole enterprise. The disaster at Leuctra in 371 before the Common Era, where the previously invincible Spartans were crushingly defeated by Thebes, led to public questioning of whether divine favour, supposedly indicated by years of favourable oracles, actually meant anything at all. The rise of Alexander the Great in the mid-4th century brought a different kind of challenge. Alexander visited Delphi demanding consultation outside the regular schedule, when the oracle was supposedly not in operation. When the Pythia refused, he physically dragged her toward the temple, and she finally exclaimed that he was irresistible. Alexander took this as his oracle and left satisfied. But the incident revealed the oracle's vulnerability to simple force, showed that even sacred protocol could be overridden by sufficiently determined power. Roman conquest brought a wave of new skepticism. Romans respected Greek culture but approached Greek religion with pragmatic calculation. They consulted oracles when politically useful, but did not rely on them the way Greeks had. Roman intellectuals like Cicero openly questioned whether prophecy was possible, whether gods cared enough about human affairs to provide guidance, whether the whole phenomenon could be explained through natural causes or human trickery. These Roman doubts, coming from the new Mediterranean superpower, carried weight that earlier Greek skepticism had not. The most sustained attack came from early Christians, who saw pagan oracles as demonic deceptions actively competing with revealed truth. Christian apologists wrote extensively against Delphi, arguing that any accurate prophecies had come from demons who possessed limited knowledge of future events, that the oracle's ambiguity proved its non-divine source, that its eventual silence demonstrated the triumph of Christ over false gods. These Christian critiques were not just intellectual disagreements, they were part of a religious war where the oracle's extinction was an explicit goal, yet through centuries of criticism, mockery, skepticism, and opposition, Delphi endured. Cities kept coming, pilgrims kept asking questions, offerings kept accumulating. The oracle survived its critics partly through institutional flexibility, adapting its operations to changing circumstances, but mostly because enough people continued finding value in what it offered, continued believing that even if they could not fully explain how or why, something real happened at Delphi, something worth preserving despite all reasonable objections. Paradoxically, the Oracle's declining religious authority in the Hellenistic period coincided with its flowering as a cultural institution. As Greek cities lost political independence to Macedonian and later Roman rule, as the old certainties of the classical age gave way to cosmopolitan mixing of cultures, Delphi reinvented itself. The sanctuary became less the voice of divine command and more the guardian of Greek cultural identity, the keeper of traditions, the symbol of a shared heritage that transcended the political fragmentation of the Greek world. The transformation began in the aftermath of Alexander's conquests. The Macedonian king's campaigns had spread Greek culture across a vast territory, from Egypt to India, creating hybrid civilizations where Greek and local traditions mixed and merged. In this new cosmopolitan world, questions about cultural identity became urgent. What made someone Greek? Was it language, religion, political systems, philosophical outlook? Delphi, ancient beyond memory, became an anchor point, a place where Greekness could be experienced in concentrated, undiluted form. The psychological function of this shift deserves attention. When political power becomes foreign, when the structures that once defined civic identity dissolve or transform beyond recognition, cultural institutions take on new significance. They become repositories of collective memory, markers of continuity, proof that something essential survives despite surface changes. Delphi filled this role magnificently, offering Greeks under Macedonian and Roman domination a place where they could still feel themselves fully Greek, where their heritage remained undiluted and uncompromised. This was not mere nostalgia, though nostalgia certainly played a role. It was active cultural work, the deliberate preservation and celebration of traditions that might otherwise fade. The sanctuary became a living archive, maintaining practices and knowledge that connected present to past, allowing each generation to experience something of what their ancestors had experienced, creating continuity across the ruptures that conquest and cultural change imposed. The Aetolian League, a confederation of central Greek states, took control of Delphi in the early 3rd century before the Common Era and stewarded the sanctuary through a period of renewal. They rebuilt structures damaged by earthquakes, commissioned new artworks, revitalized the Pythian games, and actively promoted Delphi as a cultural center. The games expanded to include more artistic competitions, music and poetry and drama gaining prominence alongside athletics. This shift reflected changing values, a civilization where cultural achievement mattered as much as physical prowess. The expansion of artistic competitions revealed something important about Hellenistic values. Athletics celebrated individual physical excellence, but music, poetry, and drama celebrated collective cultural achievements, the shared artistic traditions that defined Greek civilization. By elevating these competitions to equal status with athletic contests, the Pythian games affirmed that Greek identity rested as much in Homer's verses and Sophocles' tragedies as in Olympic victories. The Attalid kings of Pergamon, that sophisticated Hellenistic kingdom in Western Asia Minor, became major patrons of Delphi. They sent elaborate dedications, sponsored building projects, and promoted the sanctuary throughout their realm. For these kings, supporting Delphi was partly religious devotion but mostly cultural politics, demonstrating their connection to Greek heritage and their role as protectors of Hellenic civilization against the chaotic kingdoms of Alexander's successors. These Hellenistic monarchs, ruling territories that mixed Greek and non-Greek populations, needed symbols of legitimacy that transcended simple military power. Association with Delphi provided cultural credentials, linked them to the deepest roots of Greek tradition, suggested that their kingdoms, however geographically distant from Old Greece, remained authentically Hellenic in spirit and values. Roman involvement brought even more dramatic changes. As Rome conquered the Greek East, Roman aristocrats developed intense Philhellenism, a love of Greek culture that bordered on obsession. To educated Romans, Greece represented civilization, philosophy, art, everything that elevated humanity above barbarism. Visiting Greece became essential for aristocratic education, and Delphi was a required stop, a pilgrimage site not of religion but of culture. This Roman philhellenism created a paradox that Delphi navigated successfully. The conquerors revered the conquered's culture, seeking validation from the civilization they had militarily defeated. Delphi benefited from this dynamic, receiving patronage and protection from Roman emperors and senators who wanted to demonstrate their cultural sophistication. The sanctuary's authority shifted from political and religious to cultural and intellectual, but it remained authority nonetheless. Poets and historians of the Hellenistic and Roman periods wrote extensively about Delphi, preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. Plutarch, priest of Apollo at Delphi in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, wrote dialogues set at the sanctuary, exploring philosophical questions about prophecy, divine nature, and religious experience. His works revealed a sophisticated intellectual community centered on Delphi, scholars and philosophers who maintained the traditions while subjecting them to intense rational examination. Plutarch's writings are particularly revealing because they show educated people treating the oracle with simultaneous reverence and skepticism. He clearly loved Delphi, served it faithfully, believed in its importance. But he also questioned how prophecy worked, whether the gods truly spoke through the Pythia, why oracular responses had declined in frequency and ambiguity. This combination of piety and critical inquiry characterized Hellenistic and Roman intellectual culture, allowing tradition and reason to coexist in productive tension. The sanctuary's library grew to substantial size, containing not just religious texts but historical records, philosophical treatises, scientific works. Delphi became a research center where scholars could access documents preserved nowhere else. The priests were not just ritual specialists but educated intellectuals who corresponded with philosophers, contributed to literary culture, and participated in the learned networks that connected the Hellenistic world. This transformation of the priesthood reflected broader changes in how religious authority functioned. The old model of priests as primarily ritual specialists, men who performed ceremonies and maintained traditions without necessarily understanding their deeper meanings, gave way to priests as intellectuals who could defend their traditions through philosophical argument, who could engage with critics on their own terms, who understood both the religious and rational dimensions of their work. Artists continued creating masterworks. For Delphi, the great sculptors of the Hellenistic period, working in increasingly dramatic and emotional styles, produced statues that made the sanctuary a gallery of Greek artistic achievement. Victory monuments commemorating athletic competitions featured figures of unprecedented dynamism and realism. Dedications from distant cities showcased regional artistic styles, making Delphi a visual encyclopedia of Greek sculptural tradition. The architectural restoration of the temple and theatre in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era brought craftsmen from across the Greek world. These building projects became collaborative efforts, where different communities contributed their specialties, sharing techniques and traditions. The work itself was ritual, reaffirming through physical reconstruction the cultural continuity that political disruption had threatened. Musical competitions at the Pythian Games attracted performers from across the Mediterranean. These were not casual entertainments, but serious artistic contests where reputations were made and technical innovation pushed boundaries. The winners achieved fame throughout the Greek world, their names recorded in stone inscriptions that testified to their skill. Music theory, poetry composition, dramatic performance, all these arts developed partly through the competitive context Delphi provided. The philosophical schools of Athens sent students to Delphi for extended study. The maxims carved on Apollo's temple, know thyself and nothing in excess, became starting points for ethical and epistemological investigations. The oracle stories preserved in literature became case studies for logical analysis, for exploring the nature of knowledge and certainty, for understanding how humans made decisions under uncertainty. This intellectual engagement transformed how the oracle was understood. The educated no longer necessarily believed that Apollo literally possessed the Pythia and spoke through her. But they found value in the institution anyway, saw it as a repository of accumulated wisdom, a traditional practice that encoded psychological and political insights worth preserving, even if the supernatural framework was metaphorical rather than literal. This cultural renaissance could not restore Delphi's old authority as political arbiter and divine voice. Those days had passed. victims of changing worldviews and political circumstances. But it created something perhaps more enduring, a cultural institution that could survive religious decline, that could remain relevant even as belief in the gods weakened, that could preserve tradition while allowing reinterpretation. Delphi was learning to be a living museum, guardian of the past but open to the present, ancient yet continuously renewed. The deepest truth about Delphi, the revelation that archaeology and historical analysis slowly uncovered, was that the oracle had never been simply one thing. It was not purely fraud, not purely genuine. Divine contact, not purely political institution or psychological phenomenon. It was all of these simultaneously, a complex human creation that served multiple functions and meant different things to different people across its long history. The geological evidence confirmed that gases did emerge at the temple site, that the ancient accounts of vapours were not entirely mythical. Ethylene and other hydrocarbons had indeed seeped through fault lines beneath the sanctuary, particularly during periods of seismic activity. These gases, in the confined space of the temple's inner chamber, could have produced altered states of consciousness in the Pythia, facilitating the trance experiences that ancient sources described. The science vindicated this aspect of tradition, even while explaining it through natural rather than supernatural mechanisms. Modern geological surveys of the Delphi site revealed intersecting fault lines beneath the temple, precisely where ancient sources located the chasm from which vapours rose. Core samples showed limestone and bituminous deposits that, when combined with seismic activity, could release light hydrocarbon gases. Laboratory studies demonstrated that ethylene in particular, in the concentrations likely present in the temple's confined inner chamber, could produce euphoria, dissociation, and trance states closely matching ancient descriptions of the Pythia's behaviour. But the gases alone could not account for the oracle's influence. Plenty of geological sites release gases without becoming religious centres that shape civilizations. What made Delphi powerful was not chemistry but meaning, the interpretive framework that transformed a woman's trance utterances into divine prophecy. The priests who attended the Pythia, who heard her words and translated them into responses pilgrims could understand. These priests were the real oracle, the human intelligence that made sense of inchoate sounds and shaped them into politically useful, religiously appropriate, philosophically significant pronouncements. This revelation, that the oracle was fundamentally a collaborative creation between the Pythia's altered consciousness and the priest's interpretation, explained many otherwise puzzling features. It explained why responses became more carefully crafted and politically savvy over time, as the priests grew more sophisticated. It explained why the oracle could be both genuinely mysterious and practically useful, both authentically religious and shrewdly political. It explained how sincere belief and conscious manipulation could coexist without contradiction. The system's genius lay in its division of labour. The Pythia provided authenticity, the genuine altered state that convinced everyone, including herself, that something supernatural was occurring. Her trance was not performance, but genuine experience, lending the oracle an authority that mere acting could never achieve. The priests provided interpretation, applying their knowledge of politics, geography, history, and human nature to shape her utterances into useful responses. The pilgrims who consulted the oracle participated in creating its power. They came expecting divine guidance, an expectation-shaped experience. The entire elaborate ritual, the preliminary sacrifices, the sacred atmosphere, the approach to the temple through monuments testifying to previous prophecies fulfilled, all of this prepared questioners psychologically to receive whatever they heard as divinely ordained truth. The oracle worked partly because people needed it to work, because they required some authority beyond themselves to legitimate difficult decisions or provide hope in uncertain circumstances. The psychological preparation began long before pilgrims reached Delphi. The journey itself, whether by land or sea, provided time for contemplation, for formulating questions carefully, for building anticipation. The spectacular approach to the sanctuary, climbing into mountains that seemed to touch the sky, reinforced the sense of entering a threshold space between human and divine realms. The monuments lining the sacred way told stories of previous consultations and their fulfillments, creating a narrative context that shaped expectations. The cities that relied on Delphic guidance were not duped. They were using an available cultural resource to manage political problems. When a city consulted the oracle about founding a colony, the priest's response drew on extensive knowledge of Mediterranean geography, trade routes, existing settlements, and political situations. The advice was genuinely useful, informed by information networks that no individual city could match. The divine packaging made it acceptable to factions that might have rejected the same advice if presented as merely human wisdom. The priest's information networks were impressive. Pilgrims brought news from across the Mediterranean. Delphi's widespread connections meant constant updates on political situations, economic conditions, natural disasters, and military conflicts. The sanctuary accumulated knowledge the way a modern intelligence agency might, gathering data from multiple sources, cross-referencing accounts, building comprehensive understanding of the Mediterranean world's complex dynamics. The oracle's greatest power lay not in predicting the future, but in shaping it. When Delphi advised Athens to trust in wooden walls, this was not prophecy in the sense of foreknowledge. It was political judgment, a well-informed assessment that Athens' best chance lay in naval power rather than land defence. But by presenting this assessment as Apollo's command, the oracle gave political leader Themistocles the authority he needed to convince Athenians to adopt a radical, risky strategy they might otherwise have rejected. This was the oracle's real function, transforming controversial political decisions into religiously sanctioned inevitabilities. It was a mechanism for building consensus, for legitimating change, for giving communities permission to abandon traditions or adopt innovations that pure rational argument might not have been sufficient to justify. The oracle was a social technology for managing uncertainty and conflict, dressed in religious language and ritual because that was the form such technologies took in ancient Mediterranean cultures. Understanding this does not diminish the oracle's significance. If anything, it makes Delphi more rather than less impressive. The institution endured for nearly 1,000 years not because it successfully deceived people, but because it genuinely served needs that were both religious and practical, both spiritual and political. It provided a space where the divine and human intersected, where the gap between transcendent meaning and immediate practical necessity could be bridged, where communities could access wisdom greater than any individual possessed while still exercising their own judgment about how to apply that wisdom. The Pythia herself occupied a unique position in this system. She was not puppet nor charlatan, but something more complex. A woman who genuinely entered altered states of consciousness, who experienced something she and her culture interpreted as divine possession, whose utterances in that state carried an authenticity that conscious composition could not match. Whether Apollo literally spoke through her, or whether her trance state accessed deeper levels of intuition and perception, the result was the same. Words that seemed to come from beyond ordinary consciousness, that carried a weight and authority that demanded interpretation and response. Ancient accounts describe the Pythia's physical transformation during prophecy: trembling, altered breathing, eyes rolling back, voice changing in pitch and tone. These descriptions match what modern observers document in trance states induced by various means, suggesting genuine altered consciousness rather than theatrical performance. The Pythia believed she channeled Apollo, and that sincere belief made her utterances genuinely numinous, genuinely compelling in ways that conscious fraud could never achieve. The deeper historical truth was that the oracle succeeded because it was genuinely useful, because it provided real value to the communities that consulted it, because it helped solve actual problems even while maintaining its mystique. It was both sacred and practical, both mysterious and functional, both divine encounter and human institution. This multiplicity, this refusal to be only one thing, was the secret of its longevity and influence. Delphi worked because it operated simultaneously on multiple levels, meeting different needs for different people, flexible enough to adapt across centuries while maintaining continuity of tradition and purpose. Standing today among Delphi's ruins, looking across the valley where olive groves still shimmer silver-green in Mediterranean sunlight, one confronts questions that are not merely historical but urgently contemporary. What does the oracle's long success and slow decline tell us about human nature, about our relationship with uncertainty, about the institutions we create to help us navigate unknowable futures? The ancient stones offer no simple answers, but they insist that we ask the questions. human beings, it seems, cannot bear too much uncertainty. We need frameworks for making sense of our lives, for understanding our place in larger patterns, for believing that our choices matter and our futures hold some possibility of meaning rather than chaos. The Oracle provided such a framework for ancient Greeks, a way to feel that the universe was ordered, that decisions could be guided by wisdom beyond merely human judgment, that meaning and purpose existed even when immediate circumstances seemed random or cruel. This need runs deeper than mere superstition or primitive thinking. It reflects something fundamental about human consciousness itself. We are creatures who live in time, who anticipate futures we cannot see, who must make choices whose consequences will unfold in ways we cannot predict. This temporal existence creates a peculiar burden. We must act now based on assumptions about later, must commit resources and energy to paths whose destinations remain hidden. The anxiety this produces is not incidental to human experience but central to it. The Oracle offered relief from this anxiety, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by providing a framework for engaging with it. The journey to Delphi itself became a ritual of transition, transforming private worry into public seeking, individual confusion into communal practice. The act of formulating a question, of articulating clearly what one needed to know, required the kind of careful thought that often illuminates problems even before answers arrive. The Oracle's response, ambiguous as it often was, gave permission to act, provided a narrative frame within which decisions could be made and justified. Modern people, for all our scientific knowledge and technological power, face similar needs. We consult experts, seeking guidance from economists about financial decisions, from doctors about health choices, from pollsters about political futures. We trust algorithms to recommend what we should watch, read, buy, even who we might love. These modern oracles claim authority based on data rather than divine inspiration, but they serve remarkably similar functions, helping us navigate uncertainty by accessing knowledge we believe exceeds our individual capacity to gather and interpret. The parallel extends to how we respond to guidance. Just as ancient Greeks interpreted ambiguous prophecies to fit their pre-existing inclinations, we engage in confirmation bias, accepting expert opinions that align with what we already believe while dismissing equally credentialed experts who disagree. Just as the oracle's reputation depended on selective memory of successful prophecies while failures were explained away, we remember predictions that proved accurate and forget the confident forecasts that turned out completely wrong. Consider how we treat economic predictions, political polling, or technological forecasts. Experts confidently project futures based on complex models and extensive data, yet the record of accurate prediction remains remarkably poor for anything beyond the very short term. We know this, yet we continue seeking such predictions, continue structuring major decisions around them, continue treating uncertainty as something that can be eliminated through sufficient analysis, rather than something inherent in complex systems. But there is a crucial difference. The Greeks understood that the oracle's wisdom came packaged with mystery, that prophecy required interpretation, that even divine guidance demanded human judgment to apply correctly. Know thyself, the temple's inscription commanded, suggesting that seeking external guidance without understanding your own nature, your own biases and limitations, was futile or dangerous. Modern culture sometimes forgets this wisdom, treating expert predictions or algorithmic recommendations as certainties rather than probabilities requiring thoughtful, critical engagement. We have gained precision but perhaps lost wisdom in the exchange. Our forecasts come with confidence intervals and statistical significance, but we often forget that these mathematical tools describe our ignorance as much as our knowledge. The oracle's ambiguity, frustrating as it must have been to anxious petitioners, at least prevented the dangerous illusion that the future could be known with certainty. The oracle also reminds us that institutions claiming to provide access to truth or wisdom are always human creations embedded in political and economic contexts. The priests of Delphi were not disinterested servants of pure truth. They maintained a valuable institution, managed important political relationships, earned significant revenue from consultation fees and offerings. Their incentives sometimes aligned with providing accurate guidance, but not always. They had to balance truth-telling against institutional survival, prophetic integrity against political pressure. Our modern truth-producing institutions face similar tensions. Scientific journals depend on academic institutions with their own incentive structures. Media outlets require revenue that shapes editorial decisions. Technology companies provide seemingly neutral platforms while operating according to business models that profit from engagement regardless of accuracy. Recognizing these tensions does not mean dismissing institutional authority entirely, but it does mean approaching all claims to special access to truth with the kind of critical awareness that know thyself implied. The oracle's relationship with ambiguity holds particular relevance. The famous prophecies that became legendary were precisely those that could be interpreted multiple ways, that remained true regardless of how events unfolded. This was not mere cleverness or evasion. It reflected genuine wisdom about the nature of the future itself. Prediction is inherently uncertain. Complex systems are fundamentally unpredictable. Insisting on false precision, on the illusion of certainty where none exists, leads to worse errors than acknowledging the limits of foresight. Yet the oracle also shows the danger of excessive ambiguity becoming meaningless. If guidance can be interpreted to support any action, it provides no real help with decision-making. The challenge, then and now, is finding the balance between false certainty and useless vagueness, between pretending we know more than we do and abandoning the effort to gather and apply wisdom at all. This balance requires intellectual humility, the willingness to say, "I don't know," while still taking responsibility for decisions that must be made despite incomplete information. It requires distinguishing between questions that can be answered with reasonable confidence and questions that remain genuinely open. It requires accepting that some uncertainties cannot be resolved in advance, that some questions can only be answered by living through the experience and learning from what happens. Perhaps most importantly, the oracle's history reveals that institutions serving genuine human needs can endure even as the beliefs supporting them evolve. The oracle continued functioning for centuries after many educated Greeks stopped literally believing that Apollo spoke through the Pythia. It survived because it adapted, because it found new relevance as cultural institution and political arbiter, even when its religious authority weakened. This suggests that our own institutions, built on worldviews that may shift or fragment, can potentially evolve and endure if they remain genuinely useful, if they continue serving real human needs, even as the justifications for them change. The ruins at Delphi thus become a mirror, reflecting back our own searching, our own need for guidance, our own complex relationships with authority and uncertainty. The ancient Greeks who climbed this mountainside seeking the gods' wisdom were not so different from us, grasping for some assurance that our choices matter, that meaning exists, that we are not alone in navigating the beautiful, terrifying uncertainty of human existence. The oracle's voice eventually fell silent. The exact moment of its last prophecy remains uncertain, lost in the confusion of the late Roman Empire's transformation into a Christian civilization. Some sources suggest the oracle ceased operations in the late 3rd century of the Common Era. Others indicate it continued with declining frequency into the 4th century. The Roman Emperor Theodosius, issuing edicts against pagan worship in the 390s of the Common Era, may have formally closed the sanctuary, or it may have simply faded away as consultation requests dwindled, and the priests who maintained the tradition died without successors to continue their work. According to one story, perhaps legendary, the Emperor Julian, called the apostate for his attempt to restore traditional religion against Christianity's rise, sent an embassy to Delphi in 362 of the Common Era seeking a prophecy. The Pythia's final response, preserved in Christian sources that may have invented it, supposedly declared, "Tell the emperor that the glorious dwelling has fallen to the ground. No longer does Phoebus have his house, nor his mantic bay, nor his prophetic spring. The water has dried up. It was over." Whether or not those were the actual final words, they captured a truth. The oracle's time had passed. A new religious framework was replacing the old, one that saw pagan prophecy not as legitimate divine communication, but as demonic deception at best or human fraud at worst. The Christian God spoke through scripture and church authority, not through entranced priestesses breathing vapours in mountain sanctuaries. The entire conceptual apparatus that had made the oracle comprehensible and valuable was being systematically dismantled. The transition was not merely religious but philosophical and cultural. Christianity offered a fundamentally different relationship with the future, one based on faith in divine providence and revealed scripture rather than consultation with oracles. It promised salvation through belief and moral conduct, rather than through correct interpretation of prophetic ambiguity. The individual conscience, guided by scriptural teaching and ecclesiastical authority, replaced the external prophetic voice as the proper guide for navigating life's uncertainties. This shift represented a profound transformation in how people understood their relationship with the divine, with authority, with knowledge itself. The oracle had embodied a worldview where gods communicated through natural phenomena, where sacred places served as thresholds between human and divine realms, where priesthoods mediated access to transcendent wisdom. Christianity centralized authority, standardized doctrine, and ultimately rejected the legitimacy of competing claims to divine communication. The sanctuary was not destroyed dramatically. It simply ceased to function, its buildings slowly deteriorating, its treasuries emptied, its carefully maintained traditions forgotten. Earthquakes toppled columns, weather eroded inscriptions. Locals carried away stone to build churches and houses. This site gradually disappeared beneath landslides in the encroaching village of Castri, becoming legend rather than living institution, memory rather than reality. Yet the memory proved remarkably persistent. Throughout the Middle Ages, despite official Christian hostility to pagan sites, educated people retained awareness of Delphi's historical importance. Byzantine scholars copied and preserved ancient texts describing the oracle. Arabic scholars, translating Greek philosophical and historical works, carried knowledge of Delphi into Islamic intellectual traditions. Renaissance humanists, rediscovering classical culture, read the ancient sources and dreamed of seeing the oracle's ruins. The oracle's reputation survived through literature more than archaeology. Plutarch's essays on the oracle's decline, written while it still functioned, became important philosophical texts. Herodotus's accounts of famous prophecies remained popular historical narratives. The works of Greek tragedians, filled with oracular pronouncements and their terrible fulfillments, continued being copied, read, and eventually performed again. Through these texts, Delphi maintained a kind of literary immortality, even as its physical remains lay buried and forgotten. When excavations finally revealed the sanctuary in the 1890s, they uncovered not just physical remains, but a question that each generation would answer differently. What had really happened here? The stones could not settle the debates between skeptics and believers, rationalists and mystics, reductionists and romantics. They could only testify that something significant had occurred, that for nearly 1,000 years, people from across the Mediterranean world had considered this rocky mountainside sacred, had believed that here, uniquely, the divine spoke to humanity with clarity unavailable elsewhere. The archaeological work itself became a kind of revelation, layer by layer exposing the sanctuary's evolution, the successive rebuildings after earthquakes and fires, the accumulated offerings spanning centuries, the infrastructure that had supported this remarkable institution. The French archaeologist who directed the excavation removed the modern village of Castri entirely, relocating hundreds of residents to reveal the ancient site beneath. This act, controversial even at the time, demonstrated how powerfully Delphi's memory still resonated, how much modern people wanted to recover connection with this ancient place. Modern Delphi draws visitors not as pilgrims seeking prophecy, but as tourists seeking connection to the past. They climb the sacred way as countless ancient pilgrims climbed it, passing the treasury foundations, approaching the temple platform standing where the great structure once rose. The view remains as spectacular as it was in antiquity, the valley spreading below, the peaks looming above, the sense of standing at a threshold between earth and sky, unchanged by millennia. The oracle's deeper legacy lives not in stones, but in ideas that entered Western thought so completely they became invisible. The notion that major decisions benefit from consultation with sources of wisdom beyond ourselves, the understanding that guidance requires interpretation and judgment, the awareness that certainty about the future is illusory, but the effort to act wisely despite uncertainty remains essential. All of this carries forward from Delphi into modern consciousness. The psychological insight that people need, rituals to mark important transitions, need frameworks for making meaning of their experiences, need communities that share their fundamental assumptions about how the world works. This understanding shaped Greek culture partly through the oracle's influence. The philosophical recognition that know thyself must precede seeking knowledge of anything else, that self-awareness is the foundation of wisdom. This principle crystallized at Apollo's temple and echoed through Western philosophy from Socrates onward. The night comes to Delphi now much as it came in antiquity, darkness settling over the valley, stars emerging brilliant in the clear mountain air, silence broken only by wind moving through the ancient columns and over the worn stone pathways where millions of pilgrims once walked. The god no longer speaks, if he ever did. The Pythia no longer sits upon her tripod, breathing sacred vapours, delivering words that shaped the fate of cities. The priests no longer interpret prophecies or manage the political currents that once flowed through this place. But something remains. Stand quiet in the ruins at dusk, when the tour groups have departed and you have the sanctuary to yourself, and you can almost hear it. Not Apollo's voice speaking clear prophecy, but something more subtle and perhaps more true. The accumulated presence of all those who came here seeking, all those who climbed this mountain hoping for wisdom, all those who wanted desperately to believe that their questions mattered enough that the universe would answer. Their hope, their fear, their faith and doubt, their human need for meaning in the face of a life's uncertainty. This soaked into the stones and lingers still. This is the oracle's final prophecy, unspoken but undeniable. We are seekers, we human beings, questioners by nature, unable to live without meaning even when meaning proves elusive. We build institutions to help us search. We create rituals to mark the search's importance. We tell stories about times and places where the search succeeded, where truth was found, where questions were answered. Whether those stories are literally true matters less than what they reveal about who we are and what we need. The stones at Delphi testify to this truth, and in their silence they speak more clearly than any prophecy ever did.